Science versus faith, a debate that has fascinated humanity for centuries. But when it involves a mind like Stephen Hawking, the story takes on a completely different weight, something deeper, more intense, and far more thought-provoking. It begins in the quiet halls of Cambridge, where Hawking spent much of his life pushing the limits of human understanding. Confined to a wheelchair, his body weakened by ALS, his mind remained one of the most powerful in history. He explored black holes, time, and the origins of the universe with unmatched brilliance. For him, the universe was governed by laws, precise, mathematical, and, most importantly, explainable without the need for divine intervention. To Hawking, science was enough. Or at least, that's what he believed. One afternoon, during a small academic discussion, a young Muslim student approached him with a question that seemed simple on the surface but carried an unusual depth. The student didn't challenge Hawking's theories. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked, "Professor, you've spent your life understanding the universe through equations. Have you ever considered examining the Quran through the same lens?" Hawking paused. It wasn't the kind of question he was used to. Most people either debated him or admired him. This was different. It wasn't confrontation, it was curiosity. At first, Hawking treated it as nothing more than an intellectual exercise. He had studied religion before, at least broadly. Like many scientists, he saw religious texts as cultural and historical artifacts rather than sources of scientific truth. But the student insisted there were passages worth examining, descriptions of the expanding universe, the development of human embryos, and the structure of the Earth. Concepts that sounded oddly familiar. Out of pure curiosity, Hawking agreed to take a look. A translated copy of the Quran was brought to him. In the beginning, he approached it like any other text, methodically, analytically, without emotion. He read slowly, occasionally pausing to cross-reference certain passages with modern scientific knowledge. Days passed, then weeks. Something unexpected began to happen. Certain verses seemed to echo ideas that modern science had only recently begun to understand. The mention of the heavens expanding, the detailed stages of human development, descriptions of darkness in deep oceans layered upon one another. Hawking didn't jump to conclusions. He couldn't. As a scientist, he knew that resemblance was not proof. Interpretations could be influenced by bias. Words written centuries ago could be reinterpreted in the light of modern discoveries. So he went deeper. He studied the original Arabic meanings with the help of linguistic experts. He examined historical context. He compared interpretations from different scholars across time. He treated the Quran not as a sacred text, but as a subject of investigation. And yet, the questions kept growing. Late one night, surrounded by screens filled with equations and cosmological simulations, Hawking found himself staring at a model of the expanding universe. The equations were elegant, almost poetic in their precision. Every variable, every constant, working together in perfect harmony. Then, almost unconsciously, his mind drifted back to a line he had read. A line that spoke of the heavens expanding. Two completely different sources, pointing toward the same idea. But how? Was it coincidence? Was it interpretation? Or was there something more? For the first time in a long while, Hawking felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: uncertainty. Not the kind of uncertainty that drives scientific discovery. This was different. This was philosophical, existential. If the laws of the universe were so perfectly balanced, where did those laws come from? Science could explain how the universe works. It could trace events back to fractions of a second after the Big Bang. It could describe the behavior of particles, the curvature of space-time, the birth and death of stars. But it couldn't answer one question. Why? Why does anything exist at all? Why do the laws of physics exist in the form that they do? Why is there something rather than nothing? Hawking had spent his life answering, how? But now, the question of, why, stood in front of him, silent, unyielding. In the weeks that followed, those close to him noticed subtle changes. He didn't suddenly become religious. He didn't make dramatic statements. But his tone shifted, his certainty softened. During an interview, when asked about the existence of God, his response was no longer absolute. Instead of outright dismissal, he spoke about the possibility of a deeper reality, something beyond current human understanding. It wasn't an answer, it was an opening. Eventually, the same student met him again. This time, there were no scientific discussions. No debates. Just a quiet conversation. The student said something simple. Science explains how the universe works. Faith tries to understand why it exists. Hawking repeated the words slowly. How and why? Two questions, two paths, possibly leading to the same destination. The story doesn't end with a conversion. It doesn't end with a final conclusion or a dramatic revelation. Hawking remained a scientist until the end of his life, committed to reason, evidence, and discovery. But perhaps something within him shifted. Not a belief, not a rejection, just a recognition that human knowledge, no matter how vast, has limits. And beyond those limits, there may always be questions that science alone cannot answer. So the real question isn't what Hawking concluded. The real question is, if the universe is written in the language of mathematics, who, or what, wrote the language? And is it possible that science and faith are not enemies, but two different ways of reading the same reality? That answer is left for you to decide. For days, then weeks, it lingered in the background of Stephen Hawking's thoughts, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. He returned to his equations, to his simulations, to the elegant structure of spacetime models, yet something felt different now. Before, every problem had a direction, a method, a solution waiting to be discovered. Now, there was a boundary, a place where equations stopped, and questions began. Hawking didn't talk about it publicly, but internally, a shift had started. Not a collapse of belief, not a sudden embrace of faith, but a tension between two ways of understanding reality. On one side was everything he had built his life upon: logic, mathematics, observation. On the other, something less tangible, but no less powerful, a sense that not everything could be reduced to formulas. He began revisiting some of his earlier assumptions. For years, Hawking had argued that the universe could create itself from nothing, governed by the laws of physics. But now, a subtle problem stood out more clearly than before. If the universe depends on laws, where did those laws come from? Are they truly self-existing? Or do they point to something deeper? One evening, as Cambridge grew quiet and the corridors emptied, Hawking remained alone with his thoughts. His computer screen displayed a complex simulation, early moments of the universe, fractions of a second after the Big Bang. Energy fluctuations, rapid expansion, the birth of time itself. It was beautiful, perfectly ordered, almost intentional. That word caught him off guard. Intentional. He had spent years rejecting the idea of intention behind the universe. To him, intention implied a mind, a will, something beyond the physical. But as he studied the precision of the constants, the delicate balance that allowed galaxies, stars, and eventually life to exist, the question became harder to dismiss. Why these laws? Why this balance? Why anything at all? He opened his notes again, the ones he had made while reading the Quran. Lines he had marked, questions he had written in the margins. Not as a believer, but as an investigator. This time, he didn't read them to prove or disprove anything. He read them to understand. There was something unusual about the way the text approached existence. It didn't present the universe as random or accidental. It spoke with certainty, as if the existence of order itself was evidence of something greater. Hawking didn't accept it blindly. But he couldn't ignore it either. Days later, during a private discussion with a colleague, the topic unexpectedly came up. The colleague, also a physicist, asked him directly, "Do you think science will ever answer everything?" Hawking paused longer than usual. Then, slowly, he responded, "Science can answer a great deal, but whether it can answer everything is another question." It was a small statement. But coming from him, it meant something. Because for most of his life, Hawking had operated on the belief that given enough time, enough data, and enough progress, science could eventually explain all aspects of reality. Now, he wasn't so sure. The idea of a theory of everything had always been the ultimate goal, a single framework that could unify all forces, all particles, all interactions. A complete map of reality. But even if such a theory were discovered, would it explain why the universe exists? Or only how it behaves? That distinction became sharper in his mind. How describes processes. Why questions purpose. And purpose is not something equations easily capture. As weeks turned into months, Hawking didn't abandon science, he refined his understanding of its limits. He continued his work, continued his research, continued pushing boundaries. But somewhere deep inside, a new awareness had taken root. Knowledge has edges, and beyond those edges, there is mystery. The student who had first approached him never tried to force a conclusion. He didn't demand agreement. He didn't seek to win an argument. Instead, he had simply opened a door. And Hawking had stepped through it, carefully, cautiously, but willingly. In their final meeting, the student asked him one last question. "Professor, do you think science and faith can coexist?" Hawking didn't answer immediately. For a man who had spent decades speaking with confidence, certainty, and clarity, this question required something different. Not calculation, reflection. Finally, he replied, "They ask different questions." It wasn't a rejection, and it wasn't acceptance. It was something in between. An acknowledgement that perhaps the conflict between science and faith is not as absolute as people believe. That perhaps they are not opposing forces, but parallel paths, each incomplete on its own, yet meaningful in their own way. The story doesn't end with a conclusion. Because there isn't one. Instead, it leaves behind a shift in perspective. A reminder that even the greatest minds, those who unlock the secrets of black holes and time itself, can still encounter questions that remain unanswered. And maybe, that's the point. Because if everything were explained, if every mystery were solved, if every question had a clear and final answer, would we still search? Or is it the unknown, the unanswered, the unprovable, the deeply human need to understand, that drives us forward? In the end, Hawking didn't claim to find faith. But he may have found something just as important. A reason to keep asking. Not just how the universe works,